Hi, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar. My name is Cheryl. I'm head of outreach at InsideUni, and I'm going to be your chair for today. InsideUni is a nonprofit student-led project aiming to make Oxford and Cambridge applications more accessible. So basically, we crowdsource application advice from current students, which you can find for free on our website, insideuni.org, and we've put this link in the description box below too. Now, today's Q&A on applying to Oxford from North American countries is a continuation of our International Undergraduates Live Q&A series. We came up with this series as we realized that the student experience, whether this is about the application process or general student life, can be quite mysterious, especially from an international student's point of view. So we're hoping that you'll get a chance to have your questions answered by our current panel of recently graduated and a mix of current students today. We have some pre-submitted questions, but we'll also be taking live ones. So please feel free to use the YouTube chat function to introduce yourself and say which country you're from and what subject you're interested in. So now I'll pass it on to our panel to introduce themselves, starting with Parth.
Hi, I'm Parth. I'm from the States, originally from South Florida, and went to Oxford and studied philosophy and theology.
Hi, my name is Peter. I'm from Toronto, Canada. I'm currently studying math and stats. I'm a third-year student. Before going to Oxford, I had my diploma from Ontario Secondary School. I also had 10 AP scoring 5s.
Hi, I'm Hamilton. I'm now at Cambridge studying earth sciences, and I'm originally from California. And I went through the AP system, the US.
Hello, I'm Helen. So I did history at Cambridge, and then I'm from Toronto and went through the AP system as well.
And just to say that I did not apply for North America, but I did do both the OSSD, so that's the Ontario Secondary School Diploma, as well as the IBDP. So I can be on hand to answer any of those related questions as well. To start off this Q&A, we'll hear from our panelists about why they chose to apply to Oxbridge. And again, we'll start with Parth.
Sure. So I think it's easier to say this in retrospect than when I was applying, which was kind of a chaotic time. In retrospect, I think two of the best reasons, which I was kind of thinking about, but I'm much more clear about now for my having applied to Oxford, were one, the really long vacations. So if you're someone who really enjoys projects and internships and developing yourself professionally, Oxford, interestingly, even though it's very academically focused during term, can afford you quite a bit of flexibility. Half of the year is vacation. And then the second, and along a similar line, reason I applied was that the tutorial system. So, again, you're sort of assigned a lot of freedom and a lot of responsibility, and you have this essay that you have to write every week, and you have a tutorial where you discuss it. But the rest of the time, you're kind of, at least for humanities subjects, pretty free. To set your own schedule. So yeah, those are both reasons.
So personally, I agree with Parth, but the main reason for me applying to Oxford was because I'm personally doing math and stats. So before applying to universities, I did a bit of research on seeing which university has the best faculty in the area. So obviously, Oxford and Cambridge as well have very strong faculty in math-related fields. And also, like what Parth mentioned already, they, unlike US or Canadian universities, Oxford and Cambridge, so the British universities, does offer a lot of freedom in terms of how you study, how you pace yourself, and how you get to review and revise contents during the breaks. So I really like the degree they offer to you by giving you a long extended period of time where you can just revise of the content, read over them, and just completely let that content sink in, rather than having quizzes and tests along throughout the year, which can make your study very stressful. So as opposed to having quizzes and tests throughout the year, we have one final exam at the end of the year, which I personally really prefer over the North American way. And that's why I applied to the British universities.
I definitely agree with both of what Parth and Peter said already. The level of independence particularly was a very good draw in coming to Cambridge. And it's really emphasized in a way that American universities don't seem to. In addition, for me personally, I really like the idea of being able to study in Europe in a system completely different than what the US system was like. And just to be in a different country for 3 years and have that opportunity. Plus, another thing is the school itself is very international in a way that American universities don't seem to be, from my experience and what my friends have said. So I think that was a big draw as well for me.
Yeah, for me, I think because in high school, I already knew I wanted to do a humanities subject and more specifically just history for all of university. So because in North America, you have to do all of the general subject stuff in the first 2 years, like calculus courses or like science courses, even if you're planning to major in a humanities subject. So I wanted to avoid all of that. So because the British system is very focused on just doing your one subject and then nothing else. So that really appealed to me. And then the other thing, as everyone else has already said, is the teaching style. So it's very independent and it's really what you make of it. And also the tutorial or supervision system is a really good way of advancing knowledge in that one subject really well, because in that hour of your supervision or tutorial, it's basically a one-on-one or very small group style teaching. And it's you have a lot of direct contact with the academics who are the leaders in your field. And that also really appealed to me. Whereas in North America, you'd be put in classes of like 100 or even, I've heard of like upwards of 1,000 people in a single lecture. And having that direct contact with the academics, I think, is the other advantage of Oxbridge. So that's what I wanted. Yep.
Cool. I think it's fair to say, based on what our panelists have said, that there definitely are big differences between studying in America or in North America versus in Europe, or particularly the UK. Certainly things, to keep in mind, but we'll elaborate more on that later. For now, we're going to move on to our pre-submitted questions, but we'll also be taking live ones. So please ask away in the YouTube live chat. We've gotten a few specific questions that were pre-submitted about grades, required or English test requirements. And for those, we'd recommend visiting the university's website for the most updated information. For now, I will pass it on to Hamilton to start with our first pre-submitted question.
Yeah, so this first question asks, what are the most notable cultural differences between England and home? So this is one of the questions I get asked the most often, and it's one that I always have a really hard time answering. In a way, it's really hard to tell coming from the US because there's so many different cultures within the country itself. So, and also the differences between the US and the UK are quite small in a lot of ways compared to between other countries. But to answer the question, I think a lot of people in the university, at university age, are a lot more self-motivated in a way in the UK. In Europe and in the UK in particular, you have the rights and responsibilities of an adult from a much earlier age in a lot of ways. So that's an interesting way and an interesting difference. There's also many differences in the other way. For example, coming from California, I find that's a lot easier to make very casual friendships here than with people in the UK. But of course, everyone has a very different experience with that. And of course, there's tons of other differences. Like I miss the lack of good burritos in the UK, but many of these things are very minor and easily overcome.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of like really small daily life sort of things that are different in the UK, like separate hot and cold water taps, and then not having bug nets in the windows, but those are like all pretty minor things. I think that something I noticed is that class is a big topic of discussion in the UK versus in North America. And so that took a bit of adjusting in terms of how they immediately view other people. And culturally, I think, or in social situations, people from the UK do tend to be slightly more reserved, and reserved in the way that they make conversation. And also, I think the way they dress tends to be a bit more put together. But it's not anything that's going to affect your experience if you're not used to it, because moving to Cambridge, there's also a lot of other internationals, or in general, a lot of people aren't going to expect that you've watched the same cartoons growing up or anything like that. So it takes a bit of adjusting, but it's not hard to adjust into, especially because you're from North America and language itself isn't a big problem. So it leads to a lot of like fun, interesting conversations about cultural differences that you might not have expected. So
I'll just quickly add one more difference. Something I think that's positive is, at least in my experience, students at top universities in the UK tend to be a little more humble and like not as egotistic. Maybe this is just my perspective, so take it with a grain of salt. But if you compare like students at like Stanford or Harvard versus like Oxford and Cambridge, it seems like students at Oxford and Cambridge take themselves less seriously, which is nice.
yeah, I think to add on to that, that is also something I noticed when talking to other like friends who are now at North American universities. So I think there's a big difference between when you're in the same supervision as one other student, and you can talk about very academic, very niche things. And then once that's over, I get the feeling that British students don't really like to talk too academically or too niche when it's outside of the classroom. And there's more of a culture to like relax or just talk about nonsensical things versus always being wrapped up in academia or trying to flex on each other or something like that.
And now we'll pass it on to Peter to answer a live question.
Okay, so this is a live question from Jeff Martinez. The question is, so did we have an interview? If so, was it in North America, online, or did we have to fly to England? So how it works is after the initial test, you will receive an email if you are progressing through to the next stage, which is the interview stage. Usually they prefer you to fly over to UK for the interview, where you're sitting in a room with the professors or tutors in this case, and they give you a lot of questions regarding your subject, and you do an interview essentially in a room with 2 or 3 other professors, and they kind of give you questions on the go, and you have to answer them. But you do have the option of doing them online if you are unable to fly over to UK, which is what I personally did. It works very similarly to the ones that you do in person. So basically what you do is you do your interview over Skype, and they give you the question. And from a personal perspective, because I have a math related, sorry, because I'm doing math. So what they do is they tell you the question, and you're supposed to write down your solution on a piece of sheet, and you explain your solution to them as you work through the questions. So I think one very big difference between an Oxbridge interview and the American University interview is that in America, the interview is usually about your personal life. For example, what's your hobby? What kind of extracurricular do you do, et cetera, et cetera. But then for Oxbridge, usually they focus on that specific area or subject you applied to. Like Helen mentioned before, UK emphasizes a lot on that one specific subject you chose to apply for. So if you're doing, let's say, a medicine degree, then they ask you a lot about medicine-related questions. If you're doing a math degree, then obviously they're going to ask you a lot of like math questions rather than about your personal life, etc. So to summarize that up, you are allowed to choose whether you want to fly over or whether you can do it over Skype. But to make sure you keep in mind that all the questions will be related to your subject rather than about your personal life.
Yeah, so as Peter said, they do hold overseas interviews. I know they have an interview center in Toronto, But I flew over to interview so that I could talk directly with the people who were going to be making the offer. And I think it's worth remembering that the people who are interviewing you are the people who are deciding whether you get in. So I think there's a lot of advantages to being there in person, and in terms of just body language is also another point that I don't see a lot, because when you're there in person with the interviewer, they get a better feel of what kind of person you are, and because they're going to be teaching you for the next 3 years, they get a better sense of whether they want to have you as a student for the next 3 years. That being said, I think with COVID this year, most colleges at Cambridge, and I suspect also Oxford, are going to be planning to do online interviews for most applicants this year. And so I guess there will be more information about that in the future. But still, I think it would be quite a similar process where it's very subject driven. And I guess it would also mimic the way that they're doing supervisions this year, with a lot of like maybe online supervisions. So again, you're just talking with the academic for the duration of your interview. And yeah, so I don't think it definitely helps to be there in person, but it's not a necessity as long as you interview well and can talk about your subject well.
Yeah, and I think I just want to emphasize one thing here, that it doesn't matter, well, in the future. So with this year, interviews could be held virtually, but it doesn't matter whether you're interviewed, in North America, whether you're interviewing at Oxbridge, or if you're interviewing virtually, that your chances of getting in are not affected by whether you're able to physically fly over to Oxbridge to do your interview. So that's just something I wanted to clarify.
Okay, and then we have another question from Songguo Chen. The question is, what is the job prospects for North American students in the UK? How about working permits? So when you're in the UK as a student, you're on a tier 4 visa, which allows you to work, I'm not sure about the exact hours, but I think it's 20 hours during term time a week, and then unlimited hours during vacation periods. So Cambridge technically doesn't allow students to work during term, but outside of term, you can apply to internships, jobs, as any UK student would, based on your tier 4 visa. And I'm not sure if you're also interested about this. I think it would be easier because of the timeline of Oxbridge and just British terms in general. It's easier to find positions in the UK versus trying to find ones back home, because, for example, if you're trying to find a summer placement, Oxford and Cambridge both end later than North American unis do. And so you might have a bit of awkward time where a lot of employers in North America are looking for people to start earlier, because in North America it ends in like May or something. So usually in June you're still doing exams and not able to be in North America. So your job prospects are more leaning towards in the UK. I get the feeling that, yes.
Sorry, now I think Parth is going to answer pre-submitted questions about grades and qualifications, and how people best accommodated to Oxbridge requirements.
Yep. So yeah, like Cheryl said, the question is about the grades and qualifications required to apply to Oxford. I think there are 3 important points here. So like number 1 is that Oxbridge have minimums, like minimum grades that are required to gain entry. This is quite explicit. So whereas at North American universities, you might see significant flexibility with respect to the grades of students who are admitted, because there's a really holistic admissions process. At Oxbridge, it's normally considered imprudent to apply if sort of below the stated requisite qualification. That being said, they do make exceptions, but generally you should look at the qualification requirement as being just that. Secondly, and the sort of good news is that there are a number of ways applying from North America that you could be qualified to apply to Oxbridge. So, the two probably more common ones are AP and IB. So I think at Cambridge, the requirement is you have 5 5s on AP exams. I think for Oxford, and Peter, you can correct me here if I'm getting this wrong, but I believe it's 3 5s that you have to get in total to be qualified. But if you don't have that, and if you also don't have the minimum IB requirement, which I don't know what that is, the third option you have is SAT 2s. So you might be familiar with these, the subject tests that you sometimes have to take in order to apply to certain top universities in the States. So another alternative option is if you get 3 scores of, I believe it's 700 or higher, it might be 750 or higher, one of those two, then that would also qualify you for entry. And finally, the last point has to do with the subjects that your scores are in. So, every course sort of has a recommended set of subjects that you'll have studied in advance of taking the course. So it's not just, any 5s on AP exams, but typically the preferences, for instance, if you're applying for, let's say, economics, and politics, that you'll have taken social science and humanities courses, and in particular, for quantitative courses, you'll have taken at least Calc AB for AP and analogous courses for IB and SAT 2s.
Yeah. So again, touching on the fact that courses in the UK in general are very specialized. So what I did was basically just focus on all humanities subjects in high school, because I knew that those were the ones that were going to matter the most. And so that does affect a bit of the course planning in advance, although it's not a big deal. I think as long as you meet the minimum qualification need or minimum requirements that are on the Oxford and Cambridge websites, you're in standing to be competitive. And then the thing that will push you over is like how well you interview, I feel, because obviously everyone on paper is going to be quite strong. And let me just reread the question. To accommodate to Oxbridge requirements. And I think because it's so subject focused, there's a lot you can do in high school to improve your knowledge of the subject. So if you're in humanities, for example, I would just read way more than I needed to for projects or assignments. And that's just to really be very deep into the subject and have the flexibility of talking very with breadth and depth when you're interviewing. And yeah, just being very engaged with the subject and knowing the one subject you want to do really well, which obviously doesn't translate well if you're also wanting to apply to North American unis. So it's finding a balance between your own needs, really.
Yeah, and just one thing to follow up. Both our panelists gave super in-depth or like specific overviews about different grade requirements. As standard, of course, we'd recommend that you check out the university website for the most updated information. We applied a few years ago, basically, so we don't have the same updated information that the university would have, so definitely do double check that.
Okay. Another live question from Annalise Verbist. How did you research or choose the college you applied to? Did you apply to a specific college? Well, we're merging this with a pre-submitted question too. Did you apply to a specific college or did you submit an open application? What are the advantages or disadvantages in submitting an open application? So I did a direct application to St. John's at Cambridge. So I think there are a few things that if you're planning to apply directly to a college, you should look into. So first is what each individual college can offer. So it's slightly different at each college. And what I liked about John's is that international students don't have to move out during breaks, which obviously helps a lot with not having to pack everything up at the end of term. So that would be packing up and then moving back in 3 times a year, which is really hectic. And then each different college has different kind of resources or special college funding that they can give to students. So it's worth looking into that. And the other thing is possibly if you're interested in a specific part of the subject that you're interested in, you could look at the fellows of each college. The fellows are the teaching staff. So a lot of the time, when you're looking for a supervisor, they'll draw on the college teaching faculty or just based on who best suits your needs. But it's helpful to have a specialist in the subject or in the specialization within the subject that you possibly want to hear from, learn from, be supervised by. And yeah, I've heard about people applying to colleges for really minor reasons, like they like the grass or the sound that their shoes make. So it can also be very just based on what you feel like suits you. So.
Yeah, so I think at the end of the day, what college you choose does play a big role in your university experience, but it's also a really minor decision. So you can have the same experience at many different colleges, and you meet people from other colleges through your course, through societies, through a lot of other ways. So while it is something to take into account, it's not the be all end all of the application process. To answer the question about open applications, I had a couple friends who did open applications, and they all ended up at colleges that they loved, and they got paired with perfect colleges for them. But for the specifics, I actually went to the same college as Helen did, St. John's in Cambridge. So my primary reason, the fact that you can keep your rooms over break for no extra charge, was a really big driver. And I think more colleges have started to do this, and St. John's is by far not the only one. So that's a big difference that's important to consider. I think the only really major difference between colleges maybe is between it that my friends have kind of pointed out and I've noticed is between big and small colleges, where in a lot of small colleges, there's a sense of community that other colleges like St. John's might not have. But the smaller colleges don't always have the same resources as the bigger colleges. Not that there's anything you'll have lacking at a smaller college, but yeah, it's just a ton of differences. But at the end of the day, they don't really matter. And if you choose a college because you like the side of the main building, that's as good a reason as any.
One thing to emphasize here is that the quality of teaching or like the level of teaching is going to be the same across all colleges. So I think I once heard an admissions officer say this basically, that colleges are basically just where you live, where your community is, but like you are by no means restricted to that community. So like it's absolutely a university setting. You do get to interact with other people. And it's true that different colleges do have different vibes. But at the end of the day, it's basically just, a choice that you make, based on what you think is the right fit for you.
All right, moving on to the next question. This is also a live question from Jeff Martinez. The question says, what other North American schools did you apply to? And what was the main reason you chose UK over them? So personally speaking, I applied to, I think, something ridiculous like 20 universities in total, including Canadians, American, and also UK's. So basically, the main reason I chose UK over the others, I think there are two reasons. One, before I applied to the universities before I applied to any university at all, I did a bit of research trying to figure out which universities could offer the best for me personally. So like who has the best statistical stats degree, who has the best math degree and faculties and professors, etc., etc. So the two reasons is one, Oxford has a very strong mathematical degree there. So that was very, very enticing. And two, like I mentioned before, their scheduling is very, very appealing because not only do they offer very personalized tutorial system where you and another partner get to chat or have like teaching with one professor for an entire hour every single week. So you're allowed to ask very personalized questions. This is something US university can't really offer because in US, like what Helen mentioned before, yearly you are in a class with at least 30 or 40, in some cases, even 100 others. So you can't really ask very personalized question like, I don't really understand this part. Could you go over that with me? Or what's the motivation behind this question? Like, how do I get to that step, etc., etc. But in UK, that very personalized connection you can have with your professor, that chance they offer to you where you can ask very personalized questions is very, very helpful. And secondly, like I mentioned before, UK does give very long term breaks. So during the terms, you can obviously study and enjoy life, etc., etc. But more importantly, during breaks, you have a very extended period of time where you can really let the content sink in. You can really think and contemplate over the contents and learn them over thoroughly again, right? In the US, usually your break is a month, and then it's less than a month, I believe. And usually you spend at least a week trying to get back to your home, get back to your country, and then another few days trying to get back and adjusting to jet lag, etc., etc. So most of your break, after that, your break wouldn't be left with anything for you to really revise over the contents, relearning through the contents and really think about them. But in Oxbridge, during the breaks, you're really allowed to read over them, read through the contents again. Sometimes even finding other new contents online, related new contents online, which would really solidify your understanding of the content and the course, which I think is really beneficial for whether it be future studies or future jobs, etc. So I think that's the main reason I chose UK over the other universities at the end. Cool.
So,
go ahead, Hamilton.
This is another live question from Albert Z. And so the question is, how common are job placements and internships in continental Europe? And how are job prospects for Oxbridge graduates in continental Europe? And so I start this off by saying I don't have personal experience, but a lot of my friends have worked throughout Europe during the summer, both people from the UK, from the US, and from Europe. So I think the job prospects they're definitely pretty strong in continental Europe. Obviously, there's a lot more connections within the UK, but there's a huge amount of people who go on to do stuff in the rest of the continent. Obviously, there might be changes to that in the future with Brexit and everything, so that's something to ask a lot more people about. But I think overall they're very strong, and I've definitely considered working in Europe after graduation because it seems like a fabulous place to live. Yeah.
I'll just quickly add on to that to say that at least at Oxford, and I assume this is true at Cambridge as well, one thing the Career Service, which provides like professional support to students, does fairly well is they have a ginormous job board that's updated pretty constantly, and so that's a pretty good resource that at least Oxford offers, and I imagine Cambridge offers to help you find opportunities, of which there are quite a few in Europe.
Okay, so we'll take the next live question, which is about reference letters. This is from Julia Hind or Hind. I'm not sure, I'm sorry. Since UCAS reference letters are different to US recommendations, what advice would you give your teachers on writing them? How important is a reference for an application? So I had my high school history teacher write it, and that teacher had taught me, I think, 3 years already at that point. So I basically just sent over information from the Cambridge website about what they're looking for in a reference letter, which is basically things like how you compare to your peers, or what are your individual strengths. And I think generally what they're looking for in a reference is to have additional context about you as an applicant, and to have extra context about what kind of environment you've been in at school. And so I don't actually know what exactly my teacher wrote in the reference, but I get the sense that it's mostly for contextual information, so that when they're going over your application file, they'll know how to make sense of the number grades you have, because you are from a different educational system than the admissions, or the British system in general. And yeah, I think the better you know your teacher, the better it is. And I'll hand this over to Peter for more insight.
All right, thank you, Helen. So personally, I had my math teacher writing my reference letter for me. How important? First question was how important the reference letter was. I think obviously it's very important to have a very good reference letter, but in terms of comparing the importance of reference letter to your application, to your test, to your interview, etc., etc., I think the most important ones are the interview and your test results. Those are definitely the most important ones, because those directly determine and directly shows them how strong of a candidate you are in terms of that subject. Now, going back to the reference letter, I do agree with what Helen said already. Just to add on to what she had mentioned already is usually your teachers would really like a very clear context, very clear outline of what you want them to write for you in your application. So an advice for future applicants would be, think about what kind of aspect would you like your teacher to bring out for you, whether it be, you're a very, very good student to work with, a student who is very easy to grasp concept and who learn fast, or whether you are strong at, cooperating with others, etc., etc. So you really want to think about, before asking your teacher, what kind of things do you want your teacher to bring out from their perspective? Because for a lot of things like your personal traits, how you study, how well you learn materials, you can't really talk about these in your own application, right? So those are the unique things you would want your teachers to bring out for you. So before you go up to your teacher and ask them to do your reference letter, make sure you prepare a little bucket list and kind of just analyze and think about, this is the points I want my teacher to talk about for me, right? And you make sure you communicate with your teacher well enough so they know what exactly you want in your reference letter. And I think that would both really help the teacher who writes your reference letter and will also really help your application to make it more competitive against others, I guess. Now I had the question to Cheryl for a conclusion.
Thank you, Peter. So yes, as both of our panelists did mention, it's super useful to for your teacher or whoever's writing your reference to really know you, because that way they can basically present you in the way that you are to Oxbridge admissions office, basically. And also one thing in general about interviews, because I know this was touched on upon briefly just now. There is a lot of emphasis, or there seems to be a lot of emphasis of having a perfect interview, or oh, I must act this way, I must be the perfect package that Oxbridge is looking for, or else they won't accept me. That's not the case, and in fact, there isn't a set stereotype of the ideal Oxbridge student. The thing is, the interview, the references, the personal statement, they all come together to form a part of your holistic application. So your application is always looked at holistically from multiple factors. So it doesn't matter quite as much if you don't do so well in your interview, or if you think that your reference wasn't written so well, or you feel like your references weren't written by someone who really knew you well. Just know that they will always be judged in reference to other aspects of your application as well.
Yeah, and I would just add that there is no perfect interview per se, because really what they're looking for is someone who can be a good student and someone who can take in information well and synthesize information well, And it's not just about regurgitating information or what you know or trying to show what you know. So really a good interview would be something like not being able to adapt on the spot and being able to learn from the information that your interviewers are throwing at you well, rather than showing that you have perfect knowledge about. So for example, me doing history, it wouldn't be showing that you've read so many books about a certain topic and you know so much about that, compared to them asking you a question, giving you new information, and you being able to use that new information to come to a different answer than you might have originally. And that's also something they would be looking for in the reference letter, I'm guessing. So again, knowing your teacher really well would help your teacher being able to write something like the student, I don't know, can adapt to new information quickly. So it's not just about trying hard, it's also about just being inquisitive and curious about the subject in general, which again is sort of the spirit of their admissions process, or at least that's what I felt like. And then I'll let Peter add something quickly.
Yeah, just to quickly add to Helen's point. So basically, sometimes the interview questions could be very difficult. Speaking from personal experience, my math professor gave me a question with no answer, essentially. So rather than asking or trying to see whether you can provide a valid or correct answer, what they really look for is how you can adapt to the situation on the point, right? So for example, again, speaking from personal experience, what they were looking for was actually, whether I could work out my logic to show why this question was incorrect from the beginning. And when I was preparing for the interviews, I did read several other scenarios as well. So for example, for law students, sometimes they ask you very hard moral related law questions. And those questions don't necessarily have a right or a wrong solution or right or wrong answer. What you want to do is you want to explain your logic and explain how you came to that conclusion. And that really shows how you can adapt on the spot. So the professors really isn't trying to make you cry by giving you hard questions. What they're trying to do is trying to see how you can, at such a competitive studying, as such a high, when you are taught by literally the leaders of each field, when you're being given like hard materials, how you can adapt to them, how you can learn them, how you can, offer your solutions, offer your questions logically. I think that is the most important thing they're looking for in the interview. So if you don't feel that comfortable with your interview, or if you're not feeling very great about your interview, really don't worry about it, because at the end of the day, if you find all the questions really easy, then what more could the university offer you, right? What can they teach you? If everything they taught you are already known to you, then there's nothing more to learn, right? So don't worry about the interview, just be yourself and be confident. Now I'm going to hand the mic over to Hamilton for the next question.
Yeah, so this is a pre-submitted question, and so it reads, entry requirements for the US are 5 APs at scores of 5. Do we have to meet these entry requirements at the time of application, or can these requirements be met after we potentially get an offer? So to start with, first of all, almost no UK students actually have met their requirements by the time they get an offer. It's very uncommon to have the potential to have your AP scores before, and only some international students really have that opportunity. So if you're not going to have all your AP tests taken until senior year, that's completely fine. And I think another important thing to note is that I believe that the exact rubrics are different for each college and for universities, and so that's something to check with each college website. Yeah, and as well as email any potential tutors and everything. As for me, I did take my AP test in junior year, and I found that was super helpful in not having to worry about a conditional degree, conditional offer. But I know people for whom a conditional offer was very a great way for them to go. I'll pass it off to Helen now.
Yeah, so I actually only applied with 3 existing APs. So I had 3 5s in world history and art history and European history, I think. And so my conditional offer was that I had to get 2 more AP 5s. So yes, or it might have changed recently. So definitely check the website first. But I only applied with 3 APs, so it's doable. And we'll do the next question after this.
Yeah, I'm just going to add in a quick note here. Again, double check with the university. Things may have changed. We want you to be able to access the most updated information, so definitely go check out the university's website for that. And I'm just going to cut in here with a 5-minute warning for any last live questions to come in. And we know we haven't got around to everyone's questions, but that's just basically because we feel like some of them are better directed at Oxbridge's admissions offices, and our moderator Tammy will be redirecting you guys to their websites or their emails later. From now on, I'm going to just pass the baton quickly to Peter to answer a question about American math courses.
All right, so this is a specific question about math courses from Julia Hyde. Question is, if you have taken American math courses such as BC Calculus and multivariate calculus and are looking to study engineering, do you know if there are any obvious gaps in math knowledge? So AP BC Calculus and other related AP courses only cover up to the first year of American university math degree. There are 2 key differences I found when I entered British University in terms of math. One is in terms of trigonometry. So trigonometry, they talked a lot about the sine and cosine, which are not really learned in the American system, and which are covered by the A-level math courses. And the second difference is in terms of multivariate calculus. So the high school students in UK have already touched upon contents such as double integral, triple integral, and in terms of changing variables, etc., etc. Sorry, I'm getting a bit more too specific into this, but the key difference here are you have to work a little bit more in terms of integration and calculus, and also you have to learn a bit more in terms of trigonometry. So those are the 2 key differences I found in terms of American and also British math degree or math courses. So now I'm going to quickly hand the baton to Hamilton for the next live question.
Yeah, I just wanted to touch something about what Peter said. In my personal experience, going for a scientific degree, I found that British students had perhaps covered less material than I had, but they had covered it in a lot greater depth. So they had a lot greater foundations, but had less overall knowledge. That was just my experience with it. This next question is from Jordan Lay. And so it asks if we have any particular advice for natural science interviews. So I think the main thing to be prepared for is, at least if you're applying to physical sciences, they tend to ask you questions from every physical science. So I had friends who were asked, applying to physics, who were also asked a chemistry question, an earth sciences question, and a material sciences question. So they don't expect you to have any knowledge of those subjects necessarily beforehand. And for example, I hadn't taken chemistry in 2 years by the time I applied, so I was a bit rusty on that question. But they'll give you the requisite knowledge, and it's just about being adaptable, as people said before. So yeah, now I'll pass it off to the next question.
Yeah, so this is another live question from Alina Pace. She asked, should our personal statement focus more on our academics or extracurriculars and personal reading? I've looked at online samples and they're all quite terse. So I think that because, at least for Oxford and Cambridge, the people who are deciding whether you get an offer are the academics themselves. They're more interested in your academic history and more so about your personal reading. And what you've done to learn more about your subject. Extracurriculars in the North American sense aren't the most important. They're not really interested in whether you do instruments or sports. What the extracurriculars that would be helpful are if you're doing a science subject, for example, and you've done Olympiads, or if you've done things like essay competitions for humanities subjects. Those are all relevant to the subject, and you can bring back the point to what you've read in addition to your course. So I do think that the personal statement should be mostly about academics, more so than the way that North American universities are interested in extracurricular activities. The British or Oxbridge are very interested in what you've done to become a better student or become more knowledgeable about whatever you're applying for.
Yeah, just to add on to that, I totally agree that really the whole process is geared towards figuring out what kind of student you're going to be, and what they want to know is that you're like a competent student, and they want to know that you're a teachable student. And so, how do you signal that in your personal statement? I think there are probably three components. It's like number one, you want to signal passion. So I mean, hopefully this will be genuine. Hopefully you're picking a subject which you're applying to, which you actually are interested in, and it's something you care about, and you want to make sure that you're signaling that. The second thing you want to make sure you're signaling is competence. So if there are achievements you have, or even just experiences you've had that you think have refined your skill as, I don't know, a deductive reasoner, or your capacity to argue, or et cetera. If you've had experiences, even if they are extracurricular, you should mention them if they link to some core capacity that's involved in your subject. So like, for instance, in my subject, like philosophy and theology, in my personal statement, I wrote about my experience as a volunteer teacher at my temple. And so that's an extracurricular, but it connected to theology and my interest in it. And then I think the last thing, and this kind of relates to earlier about cultural differences between the UK and North America, is I think American applications, like the common application, for instance, it demands of you that you sell yourself really hard. I think this is probably just a stylistic suggestion, but maybe don't do that as much in the British application. So maybe the third sort of tip is be humble. They don't expect you to be like a prodigious scholar. They just expect you to be competent enough and to care enough. So yeah, don't oversell yourself. You really don't need to.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's good to keep in mind here, especially in the context of UK versus US applications or North American applications, is the distinction between extracurricular activities as opposed to supercurricular activities. And when we talk about extracurricular activities, we think, okay, was I student council president, and like I'm on 3 sports teams and I play 5 different instruments to grade 8 standards, something like that. The truth is these achievements are all great. But when an admissions tutor comes to sort of look at your application in the context of trying to figure out your passion for your subject, or how well you are like defending your arguments, for example, they might be less important. So in that case, what they really look for is the importance, or like the presence of supercurricular activities. So these, as Parth mentioned earlier, are basically just activities that are related to your academic studies. So in Parth's case, he taught at his temple. I think, speaking from my experience as a music graduate, my involvement in different bands, wind bands, concert bands, conducting, playing instruments, that's the kind of stuff that they want to be looking out for, is your involvement with your subject, perhaps in a less academic capacity. In that case, I feel like we should move on to our next section, in which our panelists will just offer basically a short one-liner piece of advice about the one thing they wish they had known as a North American international student when they were applying to Oxbridge. And let's start with Parth again.
Oh, wow. Okay. I wasn't prepared to answer.
Sorry about that.
Does anyone else want to go ahead of me while I think for a second?
I'll go first then, and then Parth can go second. So, I mean, I think sometimes as an applicant, especially personally speaking, as an applicant, I kind of felt intimidated by how rigorous some of the interviews might have seemed. especially how hard or how technical some of the interview questions they posted online appear to be. So walking into my, well, I did my interview online. So going into my Skype call, I kind of felt really nervous, and that definitely impaired the beginning of my interview. So the piece of advice I would love to hear prior to my, if I had the chance prior to my application was, just don't really worry about anything during the application. Just be yourself, right? Sometimes if you try to please the professor too much, if you try to be someone you're not really are, then that kind of harms your application in a sense, harms your interview in a sense. So just be yourself and be friendly with the professor. Whenever they ask you a question, explain your logic, explain how you got there, and that will be really, really helpful. So just personal advice, I guess. Now I'm going to hand it over to Parth.
Thanks. Yeah, that's great. That's inspirational. I think I just building on that. Oxbridge. Well, I can only really speak for Oxford, but Oxford may seem from the outside to be this very well ordered and top of the notch place, but if you kind of look under the hood, which you end up doing, if you study there, you realize that you realize two things: like no one entirely knows what they're doing, and everyone feels at least a little bit of imposter syndrome. Everyone feels at least a little bit of like, wow, do I really belong here at this like exceptional place? And so that's an experience I had when I was applying, and for even like the beginning of my time there. The answer you should just assume is yes. Like if you care about your subject and you've done well enough, don't sort of second guess yourself, because it's at once an arcane and sort of mystical and random process, getting in, and secondly, like you're biased to like sort of think the negative thought, and so ignore that bias.
Yeah, I think those previous 2 points are really good. I think one thing I'd add is to something I wish I'd known was to consider more universities in the UK. There's a lot of really great schools that I hadn't heard of before, and doing research into other schools like would be useful, especially since you're going to do an application through UCAS anyways. If you're going to apply to Cambridge, you might as well apply to several other universities.
Yeah, I'd agree with Hamilton. I mean, I did apply to extra universities, but I think it's worth knowing that like Oxford and Cambridge aren't the all end all. I can't speak anymore. Be all and end all of universities, and because applying to multiple universities is the same cost on UCAS, it's very little effort to get extra offers from equally very good universities. And I think in terms of just the entire application process, at least with Cambridge and Oxford as well, because I think it's quite similar, is to remember that the people who are reading your application are also humans, and it's not just a like computer algorithm going through applications. And because applications are processed by college and not just by a central university admissions team, they're able to read into each application more carefully. And so you should remember that there isn't a perfect application or anything. It's more about whether you as a student suits what they're looking for, and what they're looking for varies wildly. So just be yourself, and if you've been very immersed into your subject and you are genuinely very interested in your subject, then that will come through, and there's nothing to worry about in terms of the whole application process. It's not as scary as the Telegraph or newspapers like to make it.
Yeah, and I think one thing to add for me, yet again, basically, we have this panel of students from Oxford and Cambridge, and like the one thing you really want to remember is to research the differences between Oxford and Cambridge. Both are equally good universities. I'm biased having graduated from Cambridge, but that's another story. But both will offer different things, especially with different subjects. Not all subjects are offered at each university. There will be sort of ins and outs basically based on each university. But so do your research, do double check that the curriculum is what you want it to be, and just make sure that you know what you're applying to, what you're applying for. In that case, that's the end of our applying to Oxbridge for North American countries Q&A. Thank you to all of our panelists today for giving up their time to be here. And we also want to thank the Cambridge International Admissions Office for helping us organize today's event. Each university will also be holding their open days and admissions webinars soon, so keep an eye out for signups for those. Make sure to also visit InsideUni.org and subscribe to our YouTube channel to stay up to date with our videos. That includes today's Q&A if you want to rewatch it, and our future video series on interviews and personal statements, because we've been getting lots of questions about these throughout our webinars. So we want to make it a video to address these. As I mentioned earlier, there are going to be a lot more free resources on our website, so please do check that out too. And in the meantime, let us know your thoughts on this Q&A or on future events you'd like to see us get involved with by getting in touch via our social media channels, which again are in the linked in the description below, and follow us for updates. Thank you very much for joining us today, and we hope to see you at our future events. Bye.